with two amazing scholars, two amazing women who are going to lead us in a friendly conversation about art. This afternoon we'll begin with, I think we can say Liz Lev, Professor Elizabeth Lev, who is an art historian, an author, a tour guide, living in Rome, one of the few Americans who's been there longer than I have, so she has all of my respect. A graduate of the University of Chicago, she has pursued her work at the University of Bologna and then settled in Rome. She has worked at John Cabot University in Rome, on the faculty of Duquesne University, their Italian campus, and is a member of the teaching staff of the Pontifical University of the Angelicum in Rome, as well as Christendom College. Her curriculum goes on for another 6 pages. We'll cut to the chase and say that she is also the author of The Tigress of Forlì, Roman Pilgrimage, A Body for Glory, and has publications, articles published in First Things and Sacerdos. She is not only a highly sought-after public speaker, has appeared on numerous television and radio programs, from the Today Show to the series Museum Secrets. She is a dear and precious friend of the Center for Ethics and Culture, and this afternoon we're honored to have Professor Lev lead us in a conversation about the art of friendship, the sacred conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Father Kimes. And I just want to, first of all, just thank the De Nicola Center for this wonderful topic. It's given me the opportunity to go back and look at some of my old friends, paintings, frescoes, works that I've seen a million times, and to see them with new eyes. And so in a certain sense, this topic of friendship has actually deepened my own personal friendship in the history of art. And so, I will need a clicker if I'm planning on advancing any slides, but in the meantime, I'll just start chatting. The first thing I wanted to talk about was the idea of friendship and art, which of course, I will figure it out. Me, technology, it's a thing. There's no friendship here. The idea of friendship and the visual arts and seeing something, making friendship through faces. One of the very first things that happens when man disobeys God in Eden is that he's expelled from the Garden of Eden, and that's it for seeing God's face. We go from, Adam and Eve go from naming the animals with God, during happy hour, and then the next thing you know, they are in Psalm 24, the people searching for the face of God. And so the idea is this longing that happens in trying to restore this friendship, but particularly with the face of God. Obviously, with Jesus Christ and his redemptive sacrifice, that friendship is restored. But for art, it's going to take a few generations to start to figure out how to reestablish that visual friendship through the arts, through images. And so, as they gradually began to think about it, so this sacred conversation typology of art was born. Now, actually, it doesn't really get that name until the 18th century. Officially, but the idea of this group of people, the iconography of a group of people standing around the Savior, becomes more and more and more and more developed until finally in the Baroque it really turns into sort of a sacred Italian dinner table conversation with everybody talking on top of each other. But the use of the word conversation takes us all the way back to the apostles. I mean, this idea when St. Peter talks about being in a sacred conversation, the original meaning of the term is a holy community. And so when Paul in the Philippians talks about that mentions that our conversation, our holy conversation is in heaven, it gives us kind of a marching orders of how to represent an image of saints in friendship with the Lord. And frankly, as things start, so we start with the question of introduction, so meeting people, that first kind of almost awkwardness, the very first first time you meet someone, you often, friends, have that memory of when you first met and someone said something or did something awkward, and years later you can laugh about it. There's a stiffness and a formality to the original work of friendship, and that appears in these very early works of art. So we see in one of the earliest sort of sacred conversations in Cosmas and Damian, this wonderful mosaic, you see Jesus, who is afloat, obviously regally among the clouds. You have Peter and Paul, who are dressed as Roman senators, who are presenting. The Italians have this wonderful word, presentazione. So when you introduce your friend, you present your friend in Italian. So you have this presentazione that Peter and Paul, established Roman senators in the court of heaven, are presenting their foreign friends, Cosmas and Damian, and then standing off in the wings, there's some other hopefuls. There's, Pope Felix, like, hey, I built a church, can I come? And then there's St. Theodore on the other side, who is there in substitution for the patron who happened to be an Arian heretic. So the faithful themselves are standing a story below, though. In San Cosmas and Damian, you're standing a story below, looking up towards this blue heavenly vault background. Conversation seems pretty far from you. We can aspire to it. That's a great thing to want to be, but we don't feel like it's very close to us. Then we develop this idea in something spectacular. This is the Pala d'Oro from San Marco, the cathedral in Venice. And you find this sense of presence, presentazione and presence. So this enormous, it's a 10-foot by 6.5-foot, incredibly beautifully crafted golden panel with cloisonné panels. There are 250 panels in this, of which 31 through the center, particularly around the image of Jesus, you see people standing alone. And those figures standing by themselves are saints who are made present. They're standing around. You imagine this, it had a big wooden cover, and it was only opened during the liturgy. So at that moment of the Eucharist, and this thing lifts up and the light is shimmering reflecting off the golden panels. And there in the presence of Jesus, in this presence of light, you have all of the saints who are standing around. Now, they're each one confined to their own little special space. It's kind of like a Hollywood Squares of Heaven, if anybody remembers that TV show. But the fact of the matter is, they are present. You can almost imagine them during the Eucharistic prayer, Saint Perpetua, come on down. I mean, it feels like you're calling people to the stage, but the fact is they remain still confined in their space, and we are trying to get to them. And then something amazing happens. There's a new change, there's a tremendous development in the sacred conversation which takes place in the 13th century, which isn't really an accident that it happens at the moment of the rise of the mendicant orders. And suddenly, these figures that are standing there, they're present, they begin to have more active roles. And in particular, when we think of the Franciscans, I see a bunch of Dominican sisters in front of me, so I'm getting really nervous. In particular, when we talk about St. Francis and St. Dominic, there's a new type of preaching that happens. There's a new type of the use of vernacular, so people speaking in your own language. A new type of preaching that uses images from your everyday life. So even as things great and spiritual and eschatological become more everyday and understandable, so the art begins to get a little bit more relatable. And in the incredible is in the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi, we love that upper cycle with all that great storytelling. But when we go down to the lower basilica, we see these incredible images. And it's particularly fascinating that this is happening amid the Franciscan order, because after all, how was the friendship between Francis and Jesus established? Through a talking painting. Right? He was before a painted crucifix. So this idea of an image that can speak to you and form a friendship is something that then turns up in the art of the Franciscans. And so we have one altar/burial monument. There would have been an altar underneath it. These are all gone now when you're in the church. But there would have been an altar, and underneath the tomb of Napoleon Orsini would have been there. You see the Madonna and Child, and then the figures of John the Baptist and St. Francis. And these figures are against a blank background. They're against a gold background, like the Pala d'Oro. And they also sit inside these sort of architectonic spaces, but they're very lively. I mean, this is, I think, and the funny irony of sacred conversations is that from here on in, most of the sacred conversations, no one's actually going to be talking. But in this one, they actually look like they're having a conversation. And so there's John on one side holding his scroll. There's Francis on the other side showing the wounds. And this wonderful interaction between the Madonna and Child. Look at his hand on her shirt, around her scarf. They're holding hands. They're so human. And that's another element, this new vision of the humanity of Christ that's really unleashed on the world by the Dominicans and the Franciscans. The humanity of Jesus, this little infant, it seems a lot easier to make friends. And then you have Francis and John, who are both indicating evidently downwards. They are both looking towards the tomb. They're pointing towards the tomb of the Cardinal Napoleon. And the idea is, of course, that they are introducing their friend Napoleon to the sacred conversation. Then, only a few years later, Pietro Lorenzetti returns to the same subject matter. Here are our two hands pointing downwards. He returns to the same subject matter on the opposite side. And underneath this unbelievably cerulean blue crucifixion, which is so magical to look at in that space, if you look down on the lower right-hand side, there's a little panel of the Madonna and Child and two saints. There was another tomb on that side, probably belonging to a man named Giovanni di Simone, and in 1320, Pietro Lorenzetti made a second Madonna and Child and saints. And what happens? All the architectonic barriers are gone. So now people are beginning to interact without these divisions. You have the Madonna and Child, you have John the Evangelist on one side, you have Francis on the other side. This is one of the greatest gestures in the history of art. Mary, hey, that guy? So should I listen to that guy? So Jesus looks up as if he's speaking to her, and then she's pointing in back of her with her thumb to Francis. And what's Francis doing? His hand is damaged, but he was indicating down towards the donor who is there on the right. So this new type of conversation, this new type of sacred conversation, instead of having this concept of the sanctus, the set apart that we saw in the Pala d'Altare, where each one is in this individual space, the saints are becoming, in the words of Rona Goffin, who was really one of the great pioneers in talking about the sacred conversation, they become our surrogates. And so there are Francis and John the Evangelist and anybody else you'd like, they're ready to introduce you. This is my friend. May I introduce you to my friend? And then from there, the Florentines started to ruminate and think and get involved with antiquity. And they asked themselves a wonderful question: what is friendship? And they asked it in the most wonderful way by holding a poetry contest. They got art involved. Not a painting contest. Painting wasn't quite that elevated in that period. But on October 22nd of 1441, they called together 8 of the great poets from the highest patrician to the lowest plebeian. They chose 8 poems to describe and discuss friendship. Most of the discussions were based on the writings of Cicero. For some reason, they seem to have preferred looking at Cicero as a source over Aristotle, but that would most likely be because, one, he's Italian, and two also because the fact that Cicero managed to navigate political, professional, and personal friendships in such incredibly trying times is a very good model for the Florentines, who, between exiles and constantly changing political parties, the practical ability to maintain a friendship is probably what inspired the Florentines. And I couldn't resist throwing in this wonderful Pontormo painting, a painting where these are two friends of the artist. And he's painting 2 of his friends, not his patrons, not his family, his friends. And they're holding a piece of paper, and the piece of paper contains these lines from Cicero. Friendship embraces innumerable ends. Turn where you will, it is ever at your side. No barrier shuts it out. It is never untimely and never in the way. So they're trying to picture, even in their own personal relationships, friendship. And while Cicero's reading of friendship was based on these 3 main elements, profit, virtue, pleasure, it resonated, of course, in the complicated world of the Florentine patrons, but At the end of the day, Cicero basically concludes it's extremely hard to have ideal friendship, right? It's incredibly hard to find virtuous men who are not bonded together by personal gain, and that it's almost impossible to achieve a true or ideal friendship. But the Florentines do have an answer. Christianity does have an answer, and they have the example of God or his Son, Jesus Christ, in ideal friendship. And so, when the plebeian poet came to make his speech, he got up in much more simple poetry. All the poems, by the way, were in Italian so that everybody could understand. He submitted these lines. Sometimes for desire and sometimes for disdain, anger deprives us of the capacity for virtue and turns us to vice, more's the pity, and strips friendship bare and creates hatred unworthy of heaven. But truest, I would say, without a doubt, is Almighty God, who is truly loving to all his friends, and I conclude, in effect, that the friendship of God is perfect and never false, and yes, all else is partnership. Now, this poetry contest was organized by Cosimo de' Medici, one of the greatest patrons in Florence. The actual on-the-ground Carter Sneed was Leon Battista Alberti, the great humanist, poet, Renaissance man, was the one who put everything together and made it happen. And it took place in the Cathedral of Florence. And 6 years later, what do you have? This new type of art, a familiarity among the saints, so that we can have really the idea of conversant in friendship. Familiarity is what the word sacred conversation changes to in about the 14th century. It goes from being a holy company to meaning familiarity. So with that, we get the magnificent painting by Fra Angelico, the San Marco altarpiece, which is, of course, paid for by Cosimo de' Medici. And so we have the first fruits, one of the great fruits of this poetry contest, we have in this wonderful work where we see the patron saint of Cosimo, who is looking out towards you, but then pointing inwards. The new development of one-point linear perspective has parsed the space. So we have much more of a sense of an organized, proportionate space between us and the Madonna and Child. The Madonna and Child is enclosed inside her own distinct space. She remains sanctus. She remains set apart, she in Christ. And then a line of saints come along the sides, although she herself is flanked by this group of angels. Beyond her, there is a garden, the idea of this eternal paradise. And so we are invited into this story with a figure turning towards the viewer, an idea created by none other than that Leon Battista Alberti, to invite you, Cosimo's patron, you who are already been helped by the friendship of Cosimo de' Medici. His patron, in turn, shows us, like this earthly friendship has been nice, think how much greater this heavenly friendship can be. And finally, this addition, it was an altarpiece, the addition in the foreground of that crucifix. So it becomes the liturgical object. The crucifix of the Mass is sitting there at the very front of the painting. And that brings us to what the patrician poet wrote in the famous Certame Coronaria in Florence, that the idea was, I lost my place. The friend helps us by bearing the punishment for our faults, for our sins, and to expiate such crimes, put his son on the cross as our friend. This was the poet of Mariotto, this is poetry of Mariotto Davanzotti, who gives us this idea of the ultimate friendship in the willingness to pay for our sins. The whole concept was illustrated in this amazing painting by Fra Angelico. And then 30 years later, along comes Piero della Francesca. And Piero della Francesca gives us a very different vision. It's again, an altarpiece. It was made for Federico di Montefeltro, and it's it's painted for the birth of his son. It's inside a pristine space of proportionate perfection. The group of saints stands in total silence. You can hear a pin drop in this sacred conversation. And the purest of light irradiates around the space. And it evokes both the natural world. Both Fra Angelico and Piero della Francesca are evoking the natural world. They're using marble, they're using carpets, but there's something otherworldly about both of them, particularly with this white light, this silence. Mary is completely confined within the shell at the very top, and then you see this egg coming down above her head. So she remains nonetheless distinct, even though she's grouped in with the other figures. This is a courtly image of the sacred conversation where they're together, and yet nonetheless she remains slightly apart. Each saint is recognizable, and in their stillness we begin to see these different types of role models to get to heaven. The next thing we start to do is to put very distinct, easily identifiable saints who all do different things. One's a martyr. So what have we got here? We've got Andrew, Peter Martyr, Francis, we've got John the Baptist, Bernardino, and Saint Jerome. All these different talents that are all brought to bear, all these different ways that these people found a way to converse with God, open up avenues for us to start to think what we can contribute. And then finally, after all that, the invitation. Let's meet, let's get together. And those become extraordinary. Giovanni Bellini in Venice, the new medium of oil allowed him to create a stunning atmosphere for his son Giobbe altarpiece. It's a coffered vault, and it draws the eye to this beautiful golden space in the distance. Again, Jesus and Mary are particularly set apart. They're on a very high throne this time with musical angels sitting down at the bottom. And our 6 saints who stand around again, evoke the idea of these role models. So you see them their perspective has us standing below them. We see them standing as if they're just immediately out of our space. But then again, look at the role models in front of you. That tranquil Saint Sebastian gazing off into the distance, this very brave martyr. You'll see on the other side, Job, another way of gaining heaven. Just through suffering, patiently borne. And so this different myriad of people who have all found a way to enter into this sacred conversation. But what's new? Saint Francis has turned from the group, is looking out at you with a pleading gesture. This hand reaching out into your space, this space that just reach up a little bit further, join us. He opens the wound on his side to see how close. Look at my friendship, look at my badge of honor. We're really good friends. Trust me, trust me. So this attachment which becomes more and more intense. And then we have, here we go, there's the larger figure. Suddenly we have Toulouse on the other side, and John the Baptist who just gazes raptly at the child. And then we have what I think is probably one of my favorites. This is Raphael's Madonna Foligno. It's in the Vatican Museums. It's painted in 1512. And again, we have the Madonna and child who are suspended in air. So we have the sacred conversation, which is in heaven. But Raphael's beautiful painting not only has these angels that become the same substance as clouds, look at how the clouds are tumbling down into your space, ready to join us. She's ready to come down and start joining us. And then we have taking place in nature. We're outside. We're not in these mysterious places anymore. We're not in these sort of semi-otherworldly, semi-naturalistic places. We're outside in nature. And on one side, you have one guy who's already been introduced. Everything is going great. There's Saint Jerome, who's presenting his friend Sigismondo dei Conti to the picture. You figured it out already. If you pay for it, you get to be in it. But on the other side, what an amazing thing that's happening. You have John the Baptist, who's gazing out at you, but pointing inwards. Saint Francis, kneeling adoringly, gazing rapt at the Virgin, but with his other hand, he indicates outwards. This is a sacred conversation. But who's the conversation about? You. Raphael is beautifully subtle. It's kind of like when you're sitting at one of those cocktail parties and you're holding your drink, you don't know anybody, and you're kind of like, uh-oh. And you're waiting for someone that will make eye contact so you can go join the group, and Raphael does it. A genteel invitation for you to come and join this holy company. Now, the last part happens after the Reformation, or basically during the Reformation. The last stage of the sacred conversation takes place as it's a conflict about how to deal with our saints, how to relate with our saints, why are we even praying to saints? And so the church comes up with a couple new images. Probably the person who gave us the word sacred conversation was coined to celebrate the art of Palma e Vecchio. And Palma e Vecchio gives us a sacred conversation like you've never seen it before. They're not distinct anymore. They're not in a separate space. They're sitting outside. It looks like a picnic. It's like someone's about to pass a thermos. They're comfortable. They're gathered together. They're a little bit too close for comfort. Everybody's kind of sitting on everybody else. It's a horizontal painting, not a vertical painting like the ones you've been looking at. It's horizontal. We gaze into a widescreen window of friends sitting together. And so you have John the Baptist, who we're now accustomed to, Mary Magdalene. On the other side, you have Catherine of Alexandria. But the great new change here is Mary reaches out and touches the head of the kneeling donor. He is now officially part of the conversation. This is not an altarpiece. It's a private devotion. It's something that goes into the house of Francesco Priuli was his name, so that he could feel like he was a friend to these people when he prayed. His prayer became more and more of establishing a friendship. If we started out with this liturgical understanding of our friendship, the personal devotion, the private time of prayer becomes much more central. But these beautiful private devotions, they help to strengthen us and to give us a sense of a true friendship. But that friendship eventually gets called to the public. And so the Counter-Reformation responds with the Bargellini Madonna by Ludovico Carracci. Ludovico Carracci in 1588, he's one of the Carracci brothers who form a new school in Bologna of an art that is much, much, much more dramatic, much, much, much more, you gotta get involved. And so in a certain sense, if the other paintings you have looked at have given you a kind of option about friendship, like I can just sort of stand there in the background and like maybe one day I could be friends with them. Or then there's a beginning of someone talking to me like, oh yeah, me? Yeah, okay, well I'll think about it. And then an invitation where you can sort of get a little bit closer with your drink and think about it. And then there's Ludovico. They're all waiting for you. Everybody in this painting is waiting for you. And they're not waiting for you to go join a picnic, because this friendship is not going to be a picnic. We're not just going to sit around the park and eat some sandwiches and have some coffee. This friendship is one that we are supposed to make ourselves better. Our friends want us to be the best. And so in this one, he opens up an enormous space between the Madonna and Child. Francis, again, kneeling, wrapped sideways, not with his back to us, wrapped sideways, already reaching down to draw us in. It's a double invitation. Mary Magdalene on the opposite side, offering up her gift, her costly oil. On one side, Francis's imitation. On the other side, this great offering of this woman's life, this woman's life and example. The difference of the colors, whether it's the somber or the more passionate, they're every single one who sees this painting, particularly if you're from Bologna, because those are the two towers in the background, so it's really addressed to the citizens of Bologna. But you are welcome to come and be sanctified. You see the dispenser for the water there. Be sanctified in this holy company. And Mary looks down together with her son. She gazes at you. They are waiting. What kind of friends keep friends waiting? And so the Counter-Reformation, the Baroque era, brings this sacred conversation to the point where we're not just watching the people speak to each other, maybe not speaking to each other, but we now are expected to respond. And as I kept going through this and thinking about all these images and looking at all these paintings and realizing what an amazing pattern there is, you can really see that the Franciscans began something, and that something grew, and it grew, and it grew, and then it blossomed, and then it became Baroque, which is a little over the top. But we see this distinct calling, invitation, participation, familiarity, in this distinct way of drawing the faithful into the conversation. And the natural question that came into my mind was, and then what happened? Because all of a sudden, this talk it ends in 1600. Yep, we're done. Because the sacred conversation peters out by the 1700s. And actually, by the time we get to the modern age, we have a little difficulty figuring out how to portray our saints. If there ever was an age where we depend on pictures to make friends, right? What's life without WhatsApp or Facebook or Instagram or whatever it is that you people are making friends with? And my friends have been dead for 400 years, so we're old school. But the fact of the matter is, whatever you are using, we're so dependent on pictures. And do we not filter the pictures? And do we not, make sure we get our best shot? And do we not try to embellish the story and get the best angle of the gelato I just enjoyed on the Grand Canal? But yet, when it comes to making images of our saints, not quite. I remember walking out, so the end of this talk came to me, and I was so excited about that canonization in October. I walked outside, and I was with these people, like, okay, these are our new saints. I'd just been at Raphael's Madonna Foligno, and I was like, okay, well, they're really great people. These stories, each one of these stories, by the way, beautiful, extraordinary, holy. Each one of them is amazing. And why? Why is it that we're so nervous about embellishing them with beautiful language or beautiful art? I would propose, as I just couldn't help it as I kept thinking about it, I would propose that this would also be a great moment for us as Catholics, with our patron saints and the saints who watch over us and the saints that we love and the saints that we're named for. So it'd be a good time for us to start thinking how to bring back an imagery of our saints that for so many years we excelled at and allowed people and other people to become friends with our saints. Or we could, keep doing that. Anyway, thank you very, very much. I hope for the young people this will be an inspiration to make a Facebook page for your favorite saint.
Liz, as always, thank you very much for quite the invitation, both a trip through the past and hope for the future, or some hope, perhaps, for new artists to get back to the divine conversation, the sacred conversation. We turn now to Jennifer Donnelly, who is a writer and a historian who lives between Lucerne, Switzerland, and Paris. For nearly 2 decades, she's worked in the field of cultural nonprofits and art diplomacy, including with the Terra Foundation for American Art, as a cultural counselor of France to the United States and the Louvre. She's now active as an independent scholar and consultant, and has recently contributed to exhibitions at the Château de Fontainebleau in France and on the Art Brut project in the canton of Lucerne, a social skills program for disadvantaged youth through creative projects. Her historical writings and her fiction have appeared in various publications in both French and English, and she's currently working on a collection of essays about the role of art in society, as well as on a historical novel. And in her spare time, she decided to come and join us. She's a graduate from the Great Books program in St. John's College in Annapolis and holds advanced degrees from institutes in France whose names I will not butcher with my French pronunciation. So we thank Jennifer for her presentation. We look forward to Moldy, Relics in Modern Art, Museums, Mass, and Friendship with Objects.
Okay, thank you everyone for being here. I know there's another very exciting panel happening at the same time in another room, so I appreciate everyone who's here, even if you came for Liz. And thank you, thank you, JP, for moderating, and thank you, Liz, for your beautiful talk, which in a weird way kind of leads into what I'm going to talk to you about for a little while. The word modern is in the title, right? So Liz has led us brilliantly up to the point of the early modern. And while I'm going to be a little bit more focused on the art historical definition of modern art, meaning, art that was more or less made somewhere in the late 1800s to somewhere in the mid 1900s. What we're really thinking about is the word modern more broadly, as starting more or less at the time of, where you led us up to. So that's perfect. I'm glad that you got your laughs with Liz, because I'm not very funny. I'm going to start with something that is a little bit sad. This is a image taken from my balcony in Paris on April 15th, and the voices that you will hear are some friends of mine.
We're calling it a straight up oven.
It is an oven.
So, it's in Paris. 6 months ago, on a beautiful April evening, fire broke out at the Notre Dame de Paris. As smoke was spotted in the sky, the streets around the Ile de la Cité began to fill with people who stared in disbelief as the iconic structure, which had for nearly 9 centuries withstood invasions, occupation, and war, teetered at the verge of collapse. In the media and on messaging apps, there was an outpouring of anguish, not only from Parisians, Catholics, and French politicians, but from people all over the world and of all confessions, as well as of none. Many dropped to their knees in the streets and began to sing hymns, and I'm actually going to pause to play a clip of that, if I can figure out how to do it, in case you did not see this in the media coverage. So what was remarkable about the reaction to the fire was not so much the size of it or the scope of it. After all, France is the top tourist destination in the world, with more than 70 million visitors each year, and Notre Dame was, until that evening, the most frequently visited monument within the country. What struck me was its quality. It was what we just saw. There was a sense of grief, not as though a building had been damaged, but as though a dear friend had been mortally wounded. The catastrophe seemed to bring to light a sentiment towards the building that transcends the tourist habits of selfies and hashtags and lies beyond sociological analyses of culture industry. It cannot be quantified or concretely demonstrated. It's the best way that I can describe it is a latent but powerful yearning to reach beyond the everyday and to connect with the eternal. What is furthermore fascinating to me is that the invitation to connect with the intangible in this instance occurs in a space that is so solidly material, that the friendship is kindled in a bricks and mortar space that is absolutely filled with things. Luminous things like the Rosetta windows made of stained glass, elegant things like the Madonna and Child carved in marble, the Vierge de l'Enfant, which was on the northern apse, prickly things like the thorns said to be from the crown of Christ, but things nonetheless, material and temporal. Now, the relationship between the material and the spiritual in a church is certainly not something that was suddenly revealed in the Notre Dame fire, but these past few months, as I look out at the damaged shell of the cathedral and I observe the efforts to merely to stabilize it, we're not even talking about reconstruction yet, we're just trying to get it not to collapse in on itself. This relationship has come to seem very relevant, meaning the relationship between the physical place and the spirit inside of it. And while I have neither the background nor the bravery, to be quite honest, nor have I just written a book about Counter-Reformation art, to resolve debates on the incarnation or on objects of veneration, as a scholar of modern and contemporary art, I do believe that we can gain fresh perspective on some of these issues by thinking about the material aspects of the Catholic Church in relationship to another sphere of human activity that joins the material and the immaterial, which is art. So, if any of you were here at the conference last year and were present at Liz and my presentation last year, I did touch briefly on this topic last year towards the end, about the comparing museums, how we look at things in museums and how we look at things in churches. So I'm starting from that point today, although I will not mention a certain hip hop artist whose name starts with B this year. And I will just propose a more sustained reflection on this question. I'm particularly interested in the ways that museums transform the objects within them, and how the audience, whether that's the art viewer or the church goer, and by that I want to make it clear, I don't necessarily mean a mass attendee. I'm really kind of much more interested in the secular, the lay visitor, a tourist really, to who's walking around in church seeing things and what's happening with that one-on-one with the viewer and the objects. So I'm interested in how the audience participates in this transformation. And I also wanted to make it clear that although my title has the word things in it, I'm not particularly interested in this or that philosophers or postmodernists' use of the word things versus objects versus artifacts versus any other word that you want to come up with for inanimate material or things that humans have made. I'm more interested in having us just open our imaginations and see the things that we see that when we're in churches all over the world. So, with that said, I'd like to move on by describing another fire, which I do not have a photograph of because it took place in 1793. We're still in Paris. We're not far from the Notre Dame de Paris. We are just across the river in front of City Hall. The Reign of Terror is in full swing. And the blaze that is taking place in this public space is not an accident like the one that we were just looking at, but a bonfire started with very precise intention by a riled up group of revolutionaries, and they're heaving something into the flames. So if we could zoom in, if we had our smartphones then, we could zoom in on the scene and we would see that what the revolutionaries are throwing into the fire are the mortal remains of Saint Genevieve, who is the patron saint of Paris. Her relics, this is a picture of the reliquary as it is now. It would have been a little bit different, similar, it's not the same one, but you can imagine that, how it would have been at the time of the Revolution, French Revolution. Her relics had been a site of veneration since her death, which was in the early 6th century. They were first venerated at her grave, which was in the abbey where she ministered, and then in a church that was built on that site, which bore her name. At the time of the bonfire, what we now know as the Pantheon, the Panthéon in Paris, was still under construction, and it was intended to be a church to Saint Genevieve. The king had deemed that the church, the tiny church, was not worthy of the patron saint of Paris, and so he wanted something bigger, and that was the Pantheon was going to be a church for Saint Genevieve. So the reliquary used to be carried through the streets in processions during feast days. It still is, and it was associated with several miracles, including the end of an epidemic of ergot poisoning in 1129. But then her relics were burned, the ashes were thrown into the Seine, and the original reliquary was taken to the mint, where the gold was melted and the precious stones were plucked off, and that was that. The social context had changed, and the object of veneration had come to represent, for those who had seized power, an institution that needed to be destroyed. When the details are removed and the story is reduced to the essential structure of power play, the fate of Genevieve's relics resemble nothing so much as the reception of modern art, I would contend. I want to unpack that a little bit by comparing the career of this sculpture, which certainly many of you will have seen before. It's called Bird in Space. There are a number by Constantin Brancusi, who was a Romanian artist who lived in Paris in the early 20th century. He made several of these sculptures, so you've all over the world. They're in collections and museums everywhere in various media: marble, metal, plaster, wood. This one is in bronze. And in the year 1926, one version was packed up from Brancusi's studio in Paris and was shipped to New York to be shown in an exhibition. Now, when the sculpture reached the United States, it should have gone straight through the Green Line at Customs. There had been the Tariff Act of 1922, which exonerated works of art from import tax. But when TSA, as it were, or the customs agents, looked at bird in space, they had a completely different idea. They saw a utilitarian object. That was their category for what they would have seen. And more precisely, an object falling under the category of kitchen utensils and hospital supplies. So I don't, spoon or knife, I'm not sure what they were thinking, but so they tried to impose the tariff for manufactured metal objects, which would have been 40% of the object's value, which would have been about $3,000 in today's terms. So a lawsuit was launched by Brancusi, and the aesthetic question of what is art became a question for the courts. So the answer, what is art, shouldn't really come to a surprise to us in 2019 when this piece is in museums all over the world. It was agreed by the judge. The verdict was that the piece was a piece of art and the import tax was avoided, and the statue went into the exhibition and somebody bought it, and it's now in the Seattle Museum of Art. The exact I think it's interesting to hear the exact language of the judge's ruling, which reads, "Whether or not we are in sympathy with these newer ideas and the schools which represent them, we think the facts of their existence and their influence upon the art worlds as recognized by the courts must be considered." Unquote. So by newer ideas, the judge was referring to abstract rather than imitative form. But more broadly, the legacy of modernism in art is the conclusion that just about any object can be considered art in a certain context. So the Urinal of Marcel Duchamp, the French artist Marcel Duchamp, is kind of overused in these art historical narratives, but it is worth mentioning, I think, all the more so because it was actually Duchamp who organized this show in New York that Brancusi was sending his statue to. And if you're not privy, as it were, to the story of the Urinal, it's that Marcel Duchamp basically he hung it in an exhibition in 1917, and he called it Fountain, and he signed an artist's name on it, and voila, suddenly it was art. So again, all of this is just to underscore the fact that the major legacy of modernism in art is to confirm that the primary criterion for judgment is not form. It's no longer form. So what is it then? In a word, context. Art is something that is produced within the parameters of what is made, displayed, and consumed as art. That is, I would say, roughly the modernist perspective. Status is determined through what you could call a language game, if you use the language of Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, meaning that the participants in this language game of art have a shared understanding of what the game is, what its aim is, what are the rules, and what are the terms that are agreed upon. So art is what is recognized as art by the museum, by the market, by academic establishments, by critics, by the courts sometimes, kind of the body of institutions and authorities that we can call the art world, following the language of Arthur Danto, who's a philosopher who is also an important critic and theorist of modern and contemporary art. So this doesn't mean, though, that art in today is a complete free-for-all. And it also doesn't mean that when modernism started to appear in art that it was new that context controlled interpretation. Prior to modernism, there were artistic authorities that controlled or at least regulated the art that was produced and consumed, such as the salons in France or the Royal Academy in the UK or the academias in Italy, and of course the Catholic Church. What modernism really brought was a recognition that this was the case, that this had always been the case, and also a shift in the authority figures from one set of authority figures to kind of another set of authority figures, from church, academy, salon, to the market, to individuals, to consumers. It follows the flow of capitalism. But bringing this back to Geneviève. Within the language game of the medieval and early modern Catholics of Paris, the reliquary was a site of prayer, of contemplation, of thanksgiving. When the language game changed, when the power shifted, the same object became seen as an object belonging to a corrupt institution that needed to be destroyed. Just as for art dealers and art collectors, Bird in Space had always been seen as a work of art, but for the customs agents in 1926, it had not been seen as a work of art. But it's slightly more complicated than that. The Genevieve's relics were destroyed. They're the first class. I've just learned about the classes of relics the last few days, actually, speaking with some of you. The first class relics were destroyed, but there had been other relics that had been gathered in other churches. And so after kind of the revolution died down a little bit and the fervor wasn't quite so fervent, these were gathered together, and then not one but three reliquaries were actually created to shelter what there was. One of which actually was in the Notre Dame, which, as far as we know, is now got melted anyway. But going on, there is the major reliquary that we saw before is in the church de Saint-Étienne-du-Mont, which is next to the Pantheon. It's a beautiful Renaissance church, and you can go and you can visit those, what the relics that are there today. So they're not completely destroyed. And yet, at the same time, the separation of church and state is very fiercely held as a political standpoint in France. Laïcité is constantly talked about in policy. And even though the majority of the French population is Catholic, or listed as Catholic, only about 4% attend Mass on a weekly basis, according to the most recent polls. President Macron he said that he is culturally Catholic, which is something that I think you hear plenty of people in France say. So what we see is the coexistence of two conflicting language games here, one in which the relics are an object of veneration and one in which they're not. You can go to this church and see them, and you can take pictures and put them on Facebook, or you can go there and you can pray. This site can be used for a secular visit or for a sacrament, as it were. And this is a gratuitous picture of my daughter being baptized right next to the chapel of, it's because she's in the audience today that I put her in there. Anyway, though, so where does this leave us? In the West, we are no longer fighting battles in the streets about relics. We're not fighting battles in the courts about what is art. We've moved on, as it were. But does this openness represent a progress of the intellect? Or does it represent the progress of indifference? Does it plunge us into an abyss of relativism? I don't think it has to. So to get at this question, I'm going to invite you we're going to move away from Paris for a moment and move over to the suburbs of the United States in the mid-Atlantic in the 1970s. And I don't actually have a picture of that, but I was flipping through Sacred Architecture magazine, which is free in the lobby if you haven't picked up your copy yet. And there's an article about Protestant church architecture, and there's a picture in there of they're kind of categorizing the ugliness of them or the lack of beauty of them. And some of the pictures that I saw there were reminding me of kind of the churches of the 1970s and 80s that I grew up in. Anyway, so point being, I've been speaking so far about the ornate ancient churches at the cultural heart of, Paris in the middle of Europe. But this is only one example, really, of the Catholic aesthetic, if you can say that. For me as a kid, there were no golden reliquaries, there were no precious stones, there was no marble, there was no gilded. I didn't grow up here at Notre Dame either, so, I guess I'd be giving a different speech if I had been. But the churches of my childhood were kind of made of poured concrete with rounded lines. The decoration were these stylized graphics of fish. Remember the 1970s fish and fish and bread and plaster statues and silk screen prints kind of hanging over the altar. St. Mary Magdalene of Northern Delaware, where I started first grade and where I made my first communion, was founded in 1951. So this is 800 years after the first stone of Notre Dame was laid and 1,500 years after Saint Genevieve died. Another church I attended, Our Lady of the Lake in Hendersonville, Tennessee, was built in 1973, and these things are brand new. So when I finally visited Europe for the first time in my teens, I was like Mark Twain in The Innocents Abroad, right? Which he wrote in 1867. He took a pleasure trip around Western Europe and the Holy Land. And I'm going to read a quote. When he was actually in Italy when he wrote this, but he's reflecting on the relics. He said, this is Mark Twain, "Isn't this relic matter a little overdone? We find a piece of the true cross in every old church we go into, and some of the nails that held it together. I think we have seen as much as a keg of these nails. Then there is the crown of thorns. They have part of one in Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, and part of one also in Notre Dame. And as for the bones of Saint-Denis, I feel certain that we have seen enough of them to duplicate him if necessary." So like Twain, I was a novice to the luxurious churches filled with marble and gilding and miraculous relics of Europe during my first visit. I can still recall the first time I saw a relic in Rome, and I was 16 years old, and I was looking into the glass box and trying to ascertain whether the face was fabric or skin and bone. It was new to me. So The Innocent Abroad, in this perspective, might be a little bit humorous, but of course some critiques of the things in Catholic churches have been much more aggressive. And I think if you want to read a really good account of that, Liz Lev has just published a really gorgeous new book. So go get that. But we have the Byzantine arguments on icons and iconoclasm, councils during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, the Council of Trent. For Luther or Calvin or Zwingli, there were relics and the art and artifact-filled interiors of a Catholic church were deemed as distracting to communion with the divine. They were targets of venom and violence. In revolutionary France, as we've seen, many monuments were vandalized or destroyed. The reliquary of Genevieve is one tiny example. I mean, the entire, the Tour Saint-Jacques, which is on the Rue de Rivoli, there used to be an entire church around it as large as the Notre Dame, which was destroyed. And the stone was, burned down and used for other things. So because the churches and the moldy relics that were inside of them stood for the power of the papacy and the perceived rule of religion over society, they had to be discarded or destroyed by revolutionaries in the language game of the revolutionaries. So this summary is oversimplified, of course, but what I'm trying to suggest is that there's a fraught history towards images and things within the material cultural history of the Catholic Church, which can be compared with the history of museums, not just art museums, but museums in general. In the Enlightenment, when the power of the Church was being challenged, museums were seen as a possible antidote to the old-fashioned ways of the Church. They represented a movement towards a world that was ordered, categorized, scientific. This went in keeping with the Encyclopedia of Diderot that appeared in the 1750s, the taxonomical systems of Linnaeus, etc. So an encyclopedic museum was seen as a fitting inheritor to the churches that had been overthrown, where worship and ignorance would be replaced by reason and knowledge. So by the advent of modern art, the supposedly modern institution of the museum was itself starting to be seen as old-fashioned and dusty, and museums of modern art started to be founding in the 1920s. And now at this point, those museums founded in the 1920s are themselves the subjects of criticism for having become big and bloated and slick and crassly consumeristic. The rehanging of the collection of the MoMA in New York is kind of one of the current examples of that phenomenon. So meanwhile, art was becoming dematerialized and conceptual art and performance art were gaining prominence. This is just a picture of, in 1962, what art was starting to look at. This is Yoko Ono just swings on a chair, and that was the art, right? For me, the apotheosis, I have another gratuitous picture of one of my children. This is a scene from the art art exhibition called Documenta, which happens every 5 years in Europe and Germany. It's one of the most important gathering of contemporary artists from around the world. And so what we see here is this was the room, and it was just a big empty room. So it was supposed to be an artwork. There was there was a little, text on the wall so you knew it was supposed to be an artwork, but the room was completely empty, right? So everyone was kind of walking around. All these people that you see are walking around trying to say, okay, where is the piece of art? Where is it? And that's my son playing with his little car there on the floor. But finally, so what it turned out that the work of art was, where is it? It was the air moving through the room. So, I mean, this you can read if you want what the artist's name and what the title of the work is, but it's the air. It's a gentle breeze pulling the spectator through the gallery space. That was the work of art. And yet, all those people that were milling around through the space looking for the piece of art, my son turned his stroller upside down. and the people started taking pictures of it. Because they hadn't read the wall panel, and so I guess they thought it was the piece of art. My takeaway from that was that, and what I'm trying to drive at here is that people want things. They want to behold things. We want to engage with things. It's human nature. So I'm wrapping up. I did mention last year in my talk, I'm not going to talk about a hip hop artist, but this was a slide from my talk last year. I mentioned that. I mentioned what we can do in museums when we converse, when we have conversations with art exhibitions. This is a bust, a Greek bust that's in the Louvre, which Rainer Maria Rilke wrote a poem about. I mentioned that last year, and I want to think now about conversations with the objects in a church, and I'm working towards wrapping up now. If we go back to the chapel of Sainte-Geneviève in Paris, so this is how it looks now. There's the reconstituted reliquary that we saw earlier. This is a few feet away from this. We have the tombs of Blaise Pascal and René Descartes, and also Jean Racine, all buried nearby. They're kneelers, they're benches for praying or for sitting in contemplation. There's a photo of John Paul II was on a visit there at some point in the 1980s, and there's a photograph of that there. There are plaques on the wall that you can't see here, but that offer thanks to the saint for grâce obtenue and things that are more specific than that as well. And the windows, the stained glass windows that you see in the back, they show the scene. They show the life of Genevieve. We see her, she converts to Christianity as a very young girl. She takes her vows, but basically by the time she hits puberty. And her story is she's an extremely strong figure. She is credited with staving off invasions of Paris by the Huns under Attila, breaking the lines of siege by the Franks under Childeric, and also saving the inhabitants from famine. Some of this was through prayer, and some of it was through actually crossing the lines of siege. She directed her own convent, and she maintained a close friendship with the King and Queen of France, Clovis and Clotilde, in whose conversion she also played a key role. So wrapping up here, the conversations that I have with Geneviève when I visit this site. So over the last few years, Paris was reeling from the series of terrorist attacks. There were military squads patrolling the streets. I'd be walking to school with my son, and there'd be army guys with AK-47s. And to be able to go into this space and be reminded of this woman's fortitude gives it a real sense of reassurance. It's a physical, material reminder that the city has been faced with troubles, that the city has faced up to the troubles, and that the troubles have been overcome, and the troubles will be overcome. Through this example of a strong, determined human who stood up against violence and worked to end famine and ministered to her community, we see an independent human being, independent woman who can be an example and who can be a friend. So with the multiplicity of so-called language games to choose from today, objects of veneration and objects of art can be mobile in their meanings. That's what I've been trying to demonstrate. So one reaction to this might be to fear relativism and a lack of grounding in objective truth. But in closing, I'd like to offer a different perspective. Some years before the concept of language game was laid out by Wittgenstein, he delivered a talk that's now known as his Lecture on Ethics in 1929 or 1930. It's not clear. It examines the possibility of being an ethical human from a linguistic perspective. And towards the end of this text, he makes a remark that I find extraordinary, so I'd like to read it to you. He says, "I will now describe the experience of wondering at the existence of the world by saying, it is the experience of seeing the world as a miracle. I will now describe the experience of wondering at the existence of the world by saying it is the experience of seeing the world as a miracle. Our point in sitting in the chapel need not be to discern where hagiography ends and where history begins. Our point in the museum need not be to deliberate whether the sculpture looks like a bird or whether it looks like a spoon. The point is to enter into a conversation, a sacred conversation, and a conversation that is not one-sided. It unfolds with the idea, the form, the matter, and the maker behind the object that we engage with. And of course, conversation is the greatest gift of friendship. And I would like to leave you with a picture of Notre Dame being stabilized and hopefully reconstructed before too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Just so anyone who is planning on attending the screening of Metropolitan, it begins in 20 minutes, just so you know if you're going to the screening, you need to pay attention to the clock. We're supposed to end at 2:45, but I think we can go a little over and take a few questions. So if there are questions for our two presenters, please use the microphones that are located here in the front of the room. Please, go ahead.
Thanks for your presentation. I wanted to ask Jennifer if you're familiar with the work of Thomas Struth and his photography, if you wanted to comment on how he takes the whole idea of people who are in museums looking at sacred paintings as sort of a substitute. I mean, it's a really ironic series. And if either one of you wanted to comment on the ability of art to still convert people.
Yeah, that's a good question. And she asked about there's photographs by Thomas Struth, who's a German photographer, and he makes these very large scale pictures that are photographs that are people in public spaces looking at things, and a lot of times he has a series of museum pictures. And actually, so Liz and I were talking about this earlier. Sadly, a lot of viewing situations of art today have become these kind of debacles of overcrowding and blockbuster exhibition organizing. We were talking about the Leonardo exhibition that's about to open, that has just opened in Paris, and it opened October 24th. And the tickets went on sale in June, and broke the internet. You had to reserve online, and you broke the internet. And the thing is, I believe that that's one example of something that's very huge. But art exhibition space has become very mediatic and far from this place of stillness and conversation and contemplation that we need. And I actually think that, of course, art still has the power that you mentioned, absolutely. And, everything that Liz showed us speaks, they're still friends. I mean, it speaks as much as it ever did. I find that, unfortunately, what's happened in the art world is that the conditions of being able to make that connection are becoming more and more difficult. If you want the things that are in the Vatican Museum or in the Louvre, if you want to see the Leonardos in the Louvre, I mean, you're shoulder to shoulder with so many people, and not in a nice contemplative, we all love art way. It's kind of in this get out of the way so I can take my selfie with the Mona Lisa or something like that. So the power's still there. I don't think that the context is in the greatest state right now, but I think that could change too, because we see that viewing conditions shift over time, and I'll stop talking. But there are lots of nice examples too of contemporary art being shown in more temple-like environments, which offer another alternative as well.
Liz, do you want to respond to the second half of the question?
I just had a funny little vision while you were speaking, and it was about all these times I've read about relics on display. So when they would open the crown of thorns, or even being to see the crown of thorns, you stand and everybody shows up, and you're crowded. You've got 2 seconds to touch it, and you move on. And the situations were far worse. They had to redesign churches in the 6th century because people were stomping on each other to get to relics. So I don't really have an answer. It just made me think about, I, for one, tend to put the blame on the space. I can't see it because it's crowded, because it's this, because it's that. But how many people traveled so far under such difficult conditions, and they went to go touch like some moldy old relic, and yet they felt like they had arrived. So I just sort of thinking about we do have examples of people really seeming to be satisfied and just being there, being in its presence, whether it's a selfie or I kissed the crown of thorns. Somehow being in that presence for some people is sufficient.
Please.
Hi, this question is for Dr. Love. Thank you. I'm Jennifer Keller. I go to St. Thomas, and I'm an artist as well. And my question is about the future of iconoclasm and where you see that future going, and also what is your opinion on how the church is cultivating artists for that future?
A future of iconoclasm? Or
maybe just the creation of icons in general.
So the future of iconography, basically.
Not iconoclasm. Thank you.
So it's not really as bad as, a few years ago, all I did was put my head in my hands and weep my eyes out. And I've had the good fortune since then to be involved in a lot of sacred art, Catholic art competitions. One of the most exciting ones was at St. Vincent's College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, where I had the opportunity of seeing hundreds of works by young artists. And then there was just another one in Menton and Nice, and again, hundreds of works by new young artists. So I've now begun to shift the blame from the artists, how come you aren't producing anything, to patrons, how come we're not buying anything? And I go back to the beginning. Like, why don't we, if we're going to put up 5 new saints, why don't we get an artist to make? Why don't we cultivate a Catholic artist or an artist? You don't have to hold a card up saying, "Look at my Catholic card." Just cultivate an artist to make something beautiful. So when we show these people, we're like, "Hey, look, we love this person so much. We made a really great image." I mean, people get made up for the Oscars. Why can't we make them up for a canonization? So no, I do think there is I do think we have a future. I think, however, I do think it is time, if you will, that conversation. They're trying to talk to the lay people, and I think it's also responsibility of the lay people that how come the church doesn't commission any more nice paintings? Well, Cosimo de' Medici was not the church. Cosimo de' Medici was a patron who really he influenced many other people to do the same. So the orders had the possibility of shaping the artist. The formation of the artist come from their close contact with these very dynamic religious orders. But the actual works, a great many of them, but everything I showed you, private patronage. So lay people, get up, buy art.
Hi, so my question is for both of you, and my name is Caroline O'Callahan. I'm studying studio art, painting, and theology here at Notre Dame. And you sort of answered my question a little bit, Liz, in the last answer, but my question is, I guess, about specifically sacred art within like the high art world. I mean, you can't look at like a history of Western art without looking at these great painters, Raphael and all of the Counter-Reformation and the Renaissance sacred art images of the saints and of Christ. But then when you look at contemporary high art, or like art that's going into museums and galleries, no one is doing anything that pictures Christ or pictures the saints without being something like Serrano and being like subversive and in that sense. Like, do you think that there ever will again be a place for explicitly religious art within the high art world, not just in looking at the history of it, but in the contemporary world of art?
I think Jennifer put it very well. It's about context. The high art world, as you just so aptly put forward, these works that go into Brancusi goes into a nice white space. They're works that don't require the same kind of context that the high art of a religious type would require. So again, making an altarpiece just to stick it in a gallery makes no sense. It is just why would you do that? Making images that evoke great saint stories, yes. So maybe great storytelling again. There's a lot of possibility in the idea of people love storytelling and sort of almost like the way that Philip Neri began the oratories. People like stories of saints, people like stories of saints in music. Let's just put some stories, let's sing about the saints. So, I mean, if you wanted to kind of regenerate a kind of interest in the extremely cultivated art world, I'm sort of of the opinion and sort of let them come to us. They came to us. They took all of our stuff out of our churches and put them in their museums. Let them come to us again. We should recreate. I mean, if you really want it, don't go chasing after gallery space because you play by their rules. But if we could create our own spaces in our own context, and they go and say, how come everybody's going over there and no one's coming over here anymore? That's how you get people's attention again, which I know you're going to do.
If we have 3 questions remaining, so if you could keep your questions brief, we can address all 3. So please go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for your time. As sort of a monuments man and a fan and aficionado of like physical monuments, I just wanted to draw 2 parallels and get your thoughts on this about. Sort of about the drastic changes in dynamism. If you go to the St. Joseph County Courthouse just down the street here from Notre Dame, you'll see a Civil War monument that's just full of that's an obelisk that's full of these characters, life-size statues of Civil War soldiers, swords drawn, swabs in hands, crouched and running. And then you go to the Notre Dame campus here, you'll see a World War II monument that's art, that are monoliths, and a water element in the center, and sort of form to it in terms of human forms. This drastic change in dynamism, I wanted to get your thoughts on, can the more abstract and the more modern and postmodern, even the minimalist sort of monuments that we see so common among architects to build and design monuments these days capture that same sort of conversation that these more formal, more classic forms, these expressive and dynamic forms of statuary and icons and monuments that we saw very prevalent maybe in the Gilded Age capture? Thoughts? Thank you very much.
All yours.
Well, I would say they can, and I would say that first of all, in the more traditional forms that you mentioned, there's good and bad within that too. There's some that are really powerful, and there's some that aren't so inspired, and they're kind of by the numbers. And I think it's probably the same with more contemporary forms of monuments as well. And I think one of the best examples of a really well done recent monument is the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., which regardless of whether you like it, aesthetically, whether like a long slab of black rock speaks to you or not, the idea behind it is one of friendship and conversation. I mean, you can't get, it's your face is mirrored in that shiny, highly polished glass, and you're looking at the names of all those who lost their lives in the conflict. And, there's nothing representative in that form, and yet all of those elements are there. So I think absolutely the language changes, but if there's the sincerity and the thought behind it, absolutely we can see some powerful things. So keep hope, I would say.
So despite the fact that I think we're a very visual culture in a lot of ways, I think that we've lost the ability to converse with works of art and to see the meaning of it. So what would be some habits or dispositions or practices that you think we should cultivate in order to be able to enter this conversation?
I think that one thing is a slow art movement, kind of like the slow food movement. And there's a couple of scholars who are teaching this way, a couple of professors who are teaching this way, and it's kind of getting a little bit of attention as I think there might even be a slow art day now with a website or something. Anyway, it's just the idea that rather than, we were talking about this earlier too now with the way that the Mona Lisa is now in the Louvre. And by the way, 80% of the people who go to the Louvre are polled as saying they came there to see the Mona Lisa. It's now, the new setup is that there's this like cordon sort of, like you're entering security at the airport or something, and you're moved along, like you're on a conveyor belt and you get your selfie and you go. I mean, of course, yeah, that's not a conversation, and that's not contemplation. So the idea of slow art is that kind of like you take out a timer and you sit in front of one piece, you choose a painting, you choose a bird in space, something, and you sit there, you stand there, and you spend like an hour with it, or at least more than 30 seconds. I mean, it could be 10 minutes. It can be a lot, and so that would be one thing that I would say is something very easy and very solid that you can do. You don't need a book, you don't need a guide, although a good guide is certainly a good thing. You kind of need time, and so that would be my first recommendation, and anybody can do it with any level of knowledge, expert to complete novice. Yeah, do you have anything?
I tend to think having art in the home really matters. I think it really does make a difference. We had Filippo Lippi's Madonna Child and two angels in my sister's bedroom. I don't think I ever looked at it, but that's another issue. And that painting, and we had Mercury's. We had also a copy of the John Bologna Mercury, and to have those things in the house every time I came down the stairs and there's this thing taking flight. And then the day I went to the Bargello and I saw it, and it was bigger and it was even more beautiful than it was in our living room. It was amazing. And I think that familiarity, I mean, what I hear from my students, what they respond to is, we studied this in class and then they see it. But what if they'd grown up with it and they actually see it? And that's what a friendship is. To this day, I don't go to Florence without dropping by to see that Mercury, because it's a work it formed my friendship with art. So I think the idea that you have to go to a museum, buy a ticket, stand in line, push people out of the way, that's not the easiest way to develop the friendship. Start by having breakfast with it. And also just try to express yourself. When I get upset with people, I sometimes send them pictures of paintings, and then they can figure out what I'm trying to say. I once sent the Vatican Museums a picture of the Gleaners. I don't think they liked that, but anyway, yes.
So, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll help me thank Jennifer and Liz. Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you for anything.